pleased to be here. So the title of my talk is Why Psychiatry Has to Be Social, and this is obviously a title chosen for the occasion. If psychiatry wasn't social, then there would be no sense at all to my job description. Hold on, technology. Doesn't that work? Oh, it's the other one. Okay, well, the first slide confirms that I think that no person is beyond my claims of acquaintanceship. And what I would like to say about social psychiatry is that at its best, the choice of analysis and the interpretation of analysis is driven by theory, and that's very important. And in order to make the case that psychiatry should be social, we take as an example the social nature of psychosis and schizophrenia. If we can show that that has a social nature, then we can say that psychiatry has to be social, because the disorder which some people would say was the least social of them all turns out to be social. That's important. So first of all, psychosis and schizophrenia comes out of madness as a social categorization. Some members of society are seen as consistently and persistently and idiosyncratically in error. The thing that defines psychosis is error. It's false thinking, false perceptions. And these people in the past were often marginalized and identified as mad. And this, of course, leads to the lay conceptualization of madness. However, once we got the category of madness as a social category, it was medicalized over the centuries, over the years, and this formed the basis of the concept of schizophrenia. So, schizophrenia becomes then a diagnostic category, and therefore an operationally defined disorder, but it also becomes a medical theoretical construct, and therefore a putative disease. So this is the medicalization of madness. So we need to think then about the social nature of psychosis, schizophrenia. And one easy answer to this is that the psychosis is social because the symptoms are actually defined socially. In other words, it's defined in terms of judgments of error. So what we call delusions or hallucinations, we define as judgments, we define by judging them as being in error. And error is identified by consensus. And because error is identified by consensus, then psychosis is essentially social. However, we need to do better than that. So the symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia, it's also the case, interestingly, that the symptoms of psychosis are primarily about the social world. And this is generally true, at least partly, about psychiatric disorders overall. But it's generally untrue about physical disorders. Physical disorders don't tend to be about the social world. They tend to be primarily about what's happening to you on the inside. So if we provisionally accept the usefulness of regarding psychosis as a disorder, I would argue that this construct nevertheless identifies people who are distinguished by having a high likelihood of major social traumas. And thus the disorder is social because it has a social etiology. This is an early piece of work which Robin Murray and I did years and years ago, a quarter of a century ago. And we were looking at life events and relapse in schizophrenia. And to understand this diagram, you have to realise that time flows from right to left. And having reached the age that I have, I know perfectly well that time flows from left to right. But in this diagram, time flows from right to left. So as time goes on, the person moves towards the left. And what you do is you take people who have recovered from an episode of schizophrenia, and then you follow them up and you measure the things that happen to them. You measure their life events rate. And what you find is that in the month or 6 weeks before the onset of a new episode, they experience more life events than at other times. So there seems to be an accumulation of life events before the recurrence of an episode of schizophrenia. And this is related also to the demand characteristics of life events, so that you generally find that the life events which tend to be associated with the recurrence of schizophrenia are the more major ones. However, you can actually look at the quality of the life events, at some of the qualitative aspects of life events. So people looked at threat, how threatening were life events. And if you actually narrow that down, you can identify events that were not only threatening, but were also intrusive. And intrusive events are those events where there seems to be some kind of interference, attempted control of the person by outsiders. So intrusive events are threat events which have this additional extra characterization. And the odds ratio of relapse in the face of threat events is around about 5. So if you have a threat event, your chance of relapse goes up 5-fold. However, if you look at the same sort of severity of intrusive events in the previous 3 months, the odds ratio of relapse goes up to about 17. So this additional character, an additional sort of social character of the events in question, increases the likelihood of relapse. So we may demonstrate that episodes of psychosis are brought about by triggering from social events. However, you could argue that that was a sort of rather trivial position. It's, okay, so when they relapse, it's usually because something bad has happened to them. So the cause of relapse may sometimes be social. It could be argued still that the causes of disorder are not. Causes of disorder, in other words, the de novo causes of disorder, are not social. So what we need to look at now is whether there is evidence that social factors might actually precede in a significant way the actual onset of disorder. So if we look at if we look at the phenomenon of bullying, which receives a lot of attention in the British press now, and particularly with regard to cyberbullying and things like that. But bullying, of course, is an ancient experience and has been around forever. So what we did was we looked at the British National Survey data. In Britain, we've now had 4 national randomised samples of several thousand people who've been assessed psychiatrically and socially, and this represents a serious asset in conducting social psychiatric theory testing. Not only can you look at the relationship between social variables and psychiatric disorders, but you can actually replicate your findings by using one of the other surveys. This is predicated on the belief that that although social conditions change, disorders by and large don't change in their characteristics. So it became apparent that bullying was associated quite strongly at a cross-sectional level with persecutory ideation and hallucinations, and also a diagnosis of probable psychosis in these national surveys. More interestingly, in the 2000 survey, there was an 18-month follow-up of about 2,500 people. So there were about 8,500 people were assessed in the initial sample, and then there was a stratified sample of about 2,500 of them who were followed up after 18 months and asked essentially very, very similar questions. And what was found from that was that if you reported being bullied at baseline and did not have at that point any psychotic symptoms like paranoid ideation or hallucinations, you were more likely to admit to these at follow-up. So it looks as though you had the history of bullying at time 1 but no symptoms. You were still more likely at time 2 to develop those symptoms. And not only that, but if you had paranoid ideation and a history of bullying at time 1, you were more likely than people who didn't have a history of bullying to retain your hallucinations and delusions at time 2. So it looked as though you were actually predicting the emergence of new episodes, of new experiences of hallucinations and delusions on the basis of bullying, and also the maintenance of those experiences. So that looks a little bit like social causation, doesn't it? So the 2000 survey actually for the first time included a question about sexual abuse. It wasn't a very sophisticated question about sexual abuse, and it was entered with a certain degree of terror by the people who were organising the survey because they thought that it would turn people off and they would refuse to answer any more questions or walk out of the interview or anything like that. That didn't happen. People were apparently reasonably okay about answering questions about sexual abuse. And so they were asked about sexual abuse, and they were assessed psychiatrically. And if they answered positively to the experience of sexual abuse, the odds ratio of having a psychosis diagnosis was about 15.5-fold increased. And even if you adjusted it for all sorts of other nasty things that might have happened to people, it stayed at around about 4. So there is these very high odds ratios linking reports of sexual abuse with reports of hallucinations, delusions, and probable diagnosis of psychosis. Now, it could be argued that the sexual abuse postdated the onset of psychosis because neither of those was dated. The question in the 2000 survey was sufficiently interesting for a much more elaborate procedure to be introduced in the 2007 survey. And what this involved was computer-assisted self-interview, so that the interviewer, face-to-face interviewer, would turn the computer around and give it to the participant and say, there are some questions there that I'd like you to answer using the keys in such and such a way. When you answer those questions, your answers will not be available to me, and they will only be analysed later on. So I won't know what answers you're giving. And the questions were more elaborate and also included much clearer dating in relation to when sexual abuse and other victimisation experiences occurred. So that actually led to quite good evidence that there was much more consistent and probably valid measures of sexual abuse. And it also gave us the opportunity of looking specifically at child sexual abuse, which, because it occurs in childhood and because by and large psychosis tends to occur in late adolescence or early adulthood, would be likely to precede the onset of psychotic experiences. So, hold on, what's happened? Okay, so this is just as an example showing you the age at which people in the general population in Britain if they're experiencing sexual abuse in childhood, the ages at which that was likely to happen. And there are differences for the curves for male and female respondents. But what is apparent is that the age of first sexual abuse starts to rise really quite early in life. And in females, it's as high at the age of 6 as it is at the age of 13 or 14. When we look at how common sexual abuse is, it is very common. So what we have here are 3 categories of sexual abuse. The first is uncomfortable talk, which is a sort of broad category where you're not quite sure what's being said, really. The second level is molestation, which is sexual touching without consent, and that is rather clear. And finally, there is non-consensual intercourse, which is rape. And if you look at this, the rates in male respondents was about half that in females in the different categories. But the total numbers in both males and females was quite considerable. And 1% of males had been raped during childhood and 3% of females. So these things are not uncommon. And if you look at the relationship between child sexual abuse and psychosis, you find that the odds ratios for uncomfortable talk is not actually very large. Because of the large numbers, it tends to be significant. But molestation raises the odds ratio to 3.5. But non-consensual intercourse increases your chance of developing psychosis tenfold. And any child sexual abuse at all will increase your odds will give you an odds ratio of nearly 3. Now, the population attributable fraction is a sort of interesting statistical trick which basically seeks to answer the question: if you took out this etiological factor, by how much would the prevalence of the disorder be reduced? And if you look at this, if you look at molestation, if you look at molestation, which is a sort of American term really, if you took away molestation, your rate of psychosis overall would drop by 17%. If you took away non-consensual sexual intercourse, it would drop by 14%. If you took away all types of child sexual abuse, it would drop by about 27%. And this population attributable fraction compares with copy number variation in schizophrenia, which has a population attributable fraction of about 0.6%. So if you took out copy number variation from schizophrenia, the prevalence of schizophrenia would drop by less than 1%. So this is quite important stuff, and I think actually carries with it quite a lot of the argument that I'm making for a social component to psychiatry. There are probably specific influences on delusions and hallucinations, so that people who are sexually abused seem to have a particular loading towards hallucinations, whereas people experiencing other forms of abuse are perhaps more likely to develop paranoid ideation. So these two major themes in psychosis may be somewhat differentially affected by different types of abuse. And what mediates these changes is probably different for the different experiences, which again sort of makes sense. So anyway, this leads us to think about the need for mediators, so that child sexual abuse will almost always occur before the development of psychosis, and sometimes by many years. There may be quite a considerable gap between the adverse experience and the development of the disorder. That implies that there has to be some kind of mediation between the event and the outcome. So there must be something carrying the effect of child sexual abuse through into later disorder. So I mean, experiential variables like child sexual abuse are likely to cause persistent mental representations and dispositions, and it is these that set the course for subsequent disorder, subsequent psychosis. So what we can think of when we look at psychosis is that there is a core which is important in diagnosis, that we have the concept based on psychotic symptoms, and those psychotic symptoms then form the basis for diagnosis. So the psychotic disorder is also accompanied by a whole load of other symptoms. And as psychiatrists, we don't actually lean too heavily on the other symptoms. We're really interested in the psychotic symptoms, because if you've got the psychotic symptoms, you can make a diagnosis of psychosis, and other things flow from that. So you may be less interested in the ancillary symptoms. And in fact, clinicians have often regarded them as a bit of a distraction, not being terribly interested in what the patient says about them, because they're actually more interested in the delusions and the hallucinations. And the other thing is that people tended to think that if people were anxious or depressed and had psychotic symptoms, the psychotic symptoms were causing the anxiety and the depression. And this led to this sort of topographical model of psychotic symptoms, where you've got the core symptoms over here, the hallucinations, delusions, the thought disturbance. And around the core, you've got these peripheral symptoms. And most of those are actually symptoms of affect. So they're depression, anxiety, worry, and all these other things, including nightmares. People with psychosis have nightmares, but many professionals don't know that because they never ask them. So think about potential mediators of sexual abuse in psychosis. First of all, there might be... There might be intrusive reminders of the experience, sort of reliving symptoms. Your attitudes and beliefs are very likely to have been changed by an experience like that. It may affect your styles of reasoning and styles of coping, and the styles of coping may impair the processing of the original abuse so that you don't deal with it properly. There may be affective consequences of abuse. These seem extremely likely. And finally, the severe trauma may actually modify the physiological responses to, in various ways, continuing physiological responses. So what about the role of affect in psychotic symptoms? Again, we've done a lot of analyses of these based on our national survey data from Britain. We've also used data from treatment trials of CBT for psychosis. We've used data from experience sampling methods and data from virtual reality studies. And Dan Freeman has set up a theoretical model of the way affect works in engendering and encouraging the emergence of psychosis, so that insomnia and worry and negative affect all affect the paranoid quality of thinking. Anxiety produces anticipation of threat. Depression increases the sense of vulnerability. Worry leads to implausible ideas, particularly if you're awake at night. Insomnia sort of makes your negative affect get worse, and also leads to altered perceptual states. So the idea is that these things going together reduce the threshold for the emergence of psychotic symptoms. And we've looked at this in cross-sectional and longitudinal analyses. And what we find is that paranoid ideation is strongly associated with anxiety and worry and depression, irritability, insomnia, all the things that Dan Freeman suggested. Again, in cross-sectional and longitudinal analyses, we find that paranoid ideation is strongly Right. I've had that on the previous slide. Okay. So the other thing about the longitudinal analysis, again, which is a very useful way of looking at possible causality, you find that if people don't have psychotic symptoms and are followed up, as in the 2000 survey, for 18 months, but they have anxiety and worry and all these other things, all of those things will predict new episodes of paranoid ideation. So you can lack paranoid ideation at time 1, but if you've got all these affective changes, you're more likely to show those paranoid features at time 2. So this is a summary of a whole load of work looking at the effects of being immersed in a virtual reality. The virtual reality in question was a virtual reality scenario where you place your subject in a sort of notional virtual reality cave, which takes the form of a tube train, an underground train. And so in an underground train, you have a corridor, you have people sitting down, you have people reading newspapers, you have people standing up. And in this scenario, if you walk forward into the virtual reality cave, which is the underground train, some of the people will look up, some of them will put down the newspapers and look up, people will turn towards you, some people will smile, some people will turn away, and so there are a whole load of things which happen normally in underground trains which are open to interpretation and which most people interpret as being just how bored people sitting in an underground train respond to the people around them. Now, what you can do before you put somebody in this scenario is to measure their anxiety, their worry, their perceptual abnormalities, and so on and so forth. And what you find is that if the people score highly on any of these measures, it tends to increase the likelihood that they will respond to this supposedly neutral scenario by becoming paranoid. So that in the general population, people who don't have psychosis, if you have all these affective symptoms, you are likely, if you're put into this particular scenario, to develop rather paranoid thinking. Then there's the issue of insomnia and hallucinations. If you have sleep problems, that's associated with a 2 to 4 times increase in the likelihood that you'll report hallucinations. Now, obviously, relatively few people in the population, in the general population, report hallucinations. But if they have sleep problems, that likelihood has increased. Moreover, insomnia again predicts hallucinations over the 18-month gap. So if you have no hallucinations at time 1, but you do have insomnia, then when we come and talk to you at 18 months, you are more likely to report having hallucinations. And that was a strong association, because it remained after controlling for depression and anxiety and so on. So the interesting question then becomes, if we look at all these affective components which seem to be associated with psychotic symptoms, can we see them as at all mediating the relationship between sexual abuse or some other kind of trauma and psychosis? So what we find is that about 30% of the effect of child sexual abuse on later psychosis may operate through depressed mood, which is quite a lot more than works through anxiety. The figure is about 10% for anxiety. So if you've been sexually abused and you're depressed, the chances that you develop paranoia later on are increased appreciably. And if you're merely anxious, then it's increased quite a bit, but not quite so much. And these results apply both to molestation and to child intercourse. And it's actually possible that the important aspect of mood is actually mood instability. So, how are we doing? Why are we interested in mediators? Well, whoops. Yes. So the reasons for being interested in mediators are that you might be able to treat psychosis by targeting the mediators. And it might be easier to target mediators than it is to target the psychosis. And this applies particularly to modern psychological techniques. So CBT for psychosis might well get added boost from dealing with the mediators directly and looking for the effect of treating the mediators on the outcome of the actual psychotic disorders. If there are a lot of mediators, and there are quite a lot of mediators, we look at all those effective things. If there are a lot of mediators, it may be difficult to choose the right target. But this may not actually matter there very much. I mean, it may actually be an advantage to have quite a lot to go at. So the other thing is that if you actually treat psychosis by treating a mediator and that is effective in treating the psychosis, the implication is that your hypothesis that a particular variable as a mediator will be corroborated. So it's actually got a theoretical aspects as well. So these are a couple of examples of trials where treating the mediator actually treated the outcome. This is a paper recently in Lancet Psychiatry by Daniel Freeman and his colleagues at Oxford. And his boast is that this is the largest trial of CBT it's the largest trial of CBT ever. And it's actually a digital CBT, so it's easy to deliver. And it was delivered to a rather large number of students who reported having insomnia. And you can do all this stuff online these days through social media. And after 10 weeks, the insomnia improved, but so did paranoia and hallucinations. So it looks as though treating the insomnia, this is the mediator, actually improves the paranoia and the hallucinations. So the improvements in sleeping actually mediated the improvements in hallucinations and in insomnia. So this was in the Lancet Psychiatry. And this is another of his trials, which is the WIT trial. He always chooses quite interesting acronyms. And basically, this was a CBT treatment aimed at worry in people with delusions. And what they found then was that if you treat the worry, what happens is the worry gets better, but so do the delusions. And a sizable proportion of the effect of treatment is indirect through treating the worry. So the implication there is that if you treat the worry, you can get access to the delusions, and they will improve. All right, how are we doing? Oops. I'm going to say something very quickly about this because this is something of interest, which is new, and it's about network theory in social psychiatry. And the point about the idea of networks is that there are a lot of people in psychiatry these days who say that there is a sleight of hand, and the sleight of hand is that no, I've got these slides mixed up. The sleight of hand is that in psychiatry we recognize a disorder from the symptoms, but in the beginning we actually identify the fact of a disorder from symptoms. We sort of see that symptoms occur together as a syndrome, and then we say, they go together. That means that they probably go together because there's an underlying disorder. So we infer the fact of disorder from the syndrome. And the sleight of hand is that once we've inferred a disorder from the symptoms, we then say the disorder is the cause of the symptoms. And this is not totally logical. And the effect of that is that we then start to look at the causes of the disorder as a whole. And what people have started to do recently is to go against this and talk about psychological processes having propensity to cause each other. and that this is the reason for symptom clusters, that symptoms go together because symptoms are actually causing each other, and that there is no need for an underlying diathesis. So this is an anti-psychiatric and anti-medical approach to the conceptualization of psychiatric disorder. And this has become much more popular in recent years. There are two people who particularly push this. One of them is a guy called Richard McNally in Harvard. He's a professor of psychology in Harvard. And the other one's a guy called Denny Bosboom, who's from the University of Amsterdam. And they're quite radical in their thinking about there not being diathesis, not being causes of the diathesis of psychosis, and that what there is causes of the symptoms, and the symptoms then cause each other. And if that's so, that sort of emphasizes the approach of targeting symptoms in order to effect treatment changes in psychosis. And there is some evidence already that that approach is becoming successful, for example, in the WIC trial and the OASIS trial that I've shown to you. So that these are sort of areas which are of considerable interest, and I think very much worth watching over the next few years. I think there will be considerable developments in that. And just to flag that up, I think brings me to the end of my talk. And I would encourage you to look out for the papers on network theory in psychiatry, which are coming out now, Schizophrenia Bulletin and so on. So thank you very much indeed.